The Athletic.
The terminology has changed. You're getting baffled by science talking about half spaces, low blocks, mid blocks, and they're brainwashing what is coming in from these modern managers. Is just incredible at the moment.
Hello, welcome to the Athletic Football Tactics Podcast. Thank you for joining us once again. Thanks for joining for the first time, if that is indeed the case. I'm Ali Maxwell. I'm in the studio today with Liam Tharm and with Mark Carey. How are you doing, guys?
Good, Ali. How are you?
Good. No Michael Cox with us today. When the Cox is away, the mice talk about Brighton and Hove Albion.
Of course.
Liam, you've been petitioning this for a while. We're going to talk about the race for Europe in the Premier League, but one team in particular, Brighton and Hove Albion, and one manager in particular, Roberto De Zerbi, who I think it's fair to say has somewhat taken the Premier League by storm, despite famously not knowing the league. Surprising, really. We're going to hear about his impact on Brighton and his tactics as well. Brighton might be in Europe next season. They've got two potential pathways to European football. If they win the FA Cup, they'll qualify for the Europa League, or through the league itself, where Brighton are currently 7th. They're on 42 points with Liverpool, who are just above them on goal difference, and Brentford, who are beneath them on goal difference. Brighton are the team with games in hand, 2 over Brentford, Fulham, Chelsea, Villa, 1 over Liverpool, Newcastle United. They're in a strong position. And if Manchester City or Manchester United win the FA Cup while finishing in the top 4, which you have to say is probable, then the Conference League qualification will be finishing in 7th and Europa League for 5th and 6th. So that's the picture, if you like. And what's nice about this, Liam, is that Fulham are part of this, Brentford are part of this, Newcastle United are part of this. First time that those clubs have been involved really in this conversation. And it's only, 5 seasons ago, they were all in the Championship together.
Yeah, there was a screenshot someone put up on Twitter a while ago. I think it was maybe April time, 2016-17 season. All sort of the top 6, top 7. Obviously, Newcastle and Fulham with more of Premier League history, sort of clubs that had gone down, working their way back up. And Newcastle seemed to got a tag slapped on them of almost too good for the Championship sort of thing. Obviously ended up with a title. But I think really interesting of 4 sides with, very distinct, very clear styles, very different styles, all curated now under, very, very good sort of head coaches. I know Newcastle have had a lot more investment, and there's obviously more factors surrounding that than maybe the purity that might get attached to Brighton, Fulham and Brentford. But really different ways of playing, and I think that's a really refreshing thing to see and help the season by the absence of any real mid-table. It's literally a top half, it's a top 4, a scrap for Europe, and then the big relegation battle. So it's you can't do anything about that, I guess, if you're up at the top. But it's good to see these sides pushing for those spots.
Fulham winning the Championship handily last season and kicking on, a top half finish looks likely, possible, delete as applicable. Hugely impressive for any team stepping up, having to adapt to the different rigours of the Premier League. Of course, the 2 teams they came up with struggling down at the bottom, Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth. So you talk about having a clear and unique style. It's been very effective for Fulham. How would you describe it, Liam?
I really like what they do out of possession. There's interesting sort of stats going around about some of their underlying numbers not being as good, if you look at their XGA in particular. But if you split that really by top half opposition against bottom half, they tend to get, I think, broken down a lot more by the better teams against a team sort of in the bottom half, which, that is good enough, if we're honest, to be beating most of the teams sort of below them. But a really nice 4-2-3-1. I think Andreas Pereira has been a fantastic signing at number 10, a really good partnership with Mitra up top, but, has freedom to sort of roam around. Set piece delivery is incredible, and that's been a real sort of strength of theirs this season. But their mid-block, right from sort of day one, they played Liverpool in the opening day. Really, really good, compact, organised, structured defence. I saw Ream and Diop, I think it was, at the Amex last month, and for 2 defenders that I think aren't young, lots of people don't considered to be top level defenders, really, really good in defending their box, tracking runners.
Ream's been fantastic this season.
Incredibly good. And I think that's, when you've then got Leno as well behind them, who's preventing shots at a really good rate, there's all those sort of ingredients that they're able to win both boxes really well, even if they aren't necessarily the best team sort of between them. And they've kept that identity in terms of now giving Mitro those crosses, that service that he wants. So they've just built on their strengths, which they didn't do, to be fair, last time under Parker. They played a back 3 a lot, and just the identity was not the same.
I was going to say, it felt like the last time they were in the Premier League, they didn't really have that same identity, and it was to their cost that they obviously went down as a consequence, but they've really carried on that momentum from last season. They were so emphatic in the way that they won the Championship last season. To put some numbers to what Liam's saying as well, I think we spoke already on this podcast about their set piece strength, and they've got the the fewest set pieces per goal. So the fewer set pieces per goal that you have, the better and the stronger that you are. And their 14.8 set pieces per goal is the lowest and the best in the league. So we've already mentioned how good they are there, but they also play to their strengths with Mitrovic in general of just how many passes per cross they have as well. It's something I've been looking at more and more recently, and they have the fewest passes per cross other than West Ham United in the league. So it shows how often they want to actually get it into the box using the strengths that they have with players, the fullbacks coming wide and obviously Mitrovic being able to have that aerial strength. So they have an identity, they stick to it, and they're clearly doing it very well this season.
I'm really interested in this idea of building on your strengths as a team that wins promotion from the Championship to the Premier League. We've discussed that topic a fair few times over the last few years on this podcast, which teams have done it well and which teams have struggled, and the trends, I guess, of why that might be. We've looked at teams like Sheffield United and Leeds thriving in their first season with what felt like a notably extreme style of play that maybe the teams in the Premier League weren't expecting or weren't used to playing against, and that being really good for them just in the short term. For Fulham, I guess the concern would have been, look, you're an incredible attacking team, scored over 100 goals in the Championship, but it's going to look a little bit different in the Premier League. And I think, you talking about building on your strengths, that's really interesting to me, because I'm not sure that you could necessarily say that Nottingham Forest in their approach, which was to change things up pretty considerably and keep changing things up as the season has progressed, and Bournemouth, where, without wanting to be rude, their strengths in the Championship weren't quite as obvious as Fulham's strength. Clearly they were a good team and they won football matches, but it often felt like that was more down to individual talent than any team or structure or system-based success. And clearly they have mostly struggled in the Premier League. I guess you could say that Brentford did that very well when they came up 18 months ago, building on their strengths. Liam, what are their strengths now as a team that's in 8th place, level on points with Brighton and Liverpool with 11 games left?
Yeah, they get fame for their set pieces as well. Obviously, their links to Midtjylland, etc. The variety they've got, Fulham with the same in that regard of, they're not always scoring the same set piece. They're quite diverse. They use different players. They can be unpredictable. Liverpool was a great sort of case study game for that. But I think their ability to see out wins is phenomenal. They're quite impressive in how they're probably what you class as more of an old-fashioned side, but they've made it quite attractive to be low block counter-attack. Often against bigger teams will be a 5-3-2, the Mboimo-Tony partnership. And again, this is something that's been curated for seasons in the Championship under Frank, under the same head coach. I think Coxie was saying a couple of podcasts ago, he's one of the longest serving managers of any current Premier League club, albeit not all of those games have been in the Premier League. And tactically, he's fascinating to listen to. If people watch his masterclasses he's done on the Coach's Voice, there, to hear him speak in detail about how they approach certain games in the playoffs and stuff, obviously having pushed for that promotion before and not quite got it. But they've taken 20 points off of the big 6 teams from 19 games as a Premier League outfit, which is since the start of last season. Among teams that aren't in the big 6, only Brighton have taken more, and they've got 23 since the start of last season. So
that's quite interesting in that Fulham's strength has come in being the best of or better than all the bottom half teams in the games in which they've played and avoiding the issue against the top teams, whereas Brentford going toe-to-toe with the big boys. Yeah,
and I wrote a piece earlier this season on how they consistently able to see out wins, but they don't just see out games 1-0. They'll go 1-0 up in games, or they go ahead. They'll often score a second. That will be maybe a counter-attack or a set-piece goal, but they're just incredibly hard to break down. They've got one of the best box-defending teams in the league. Ben Mee is a great addition in that regard when you look at from Burnley playing the same sort of role, albeit in a different system. Ethan Pinnock as well is an absolute monster in the air, and David Raya I think is exceptional when he comes to sort of dealing with crosses and defending his area.
Well, having that strength in both boxes aerially is obviously what's key as well. We've spoken again about their set pieces this season, 13 set piece goals scored, which is the joint highest of any team in the league. So they're certainly playing to their strengths there. And it's a similar story to Fulham in terms of their aerial presence and their set pieces. I've been looking at something recently about all teams' ability to create chances from back post chances. So I've defined that in a certain way, but everyone knows broadly what a back post chance is, and that they have the highest proportion of their total chances created from the back post. So it shows that they are clearly, have a certain way of playing, and they do it very well. We know about their throw-ins. They have 13 shots generated from throw-in situations this season, already more than double any other team in the Premier League as well. So to echo what Liam said, they do have a real clear style, and they're doing it well.
Liam, tactically or in terms of analysis, is it accepted that a back post chance would be more optimal than a front post chance? I'm kind of thinking about this for the first time as I speak, but I guess you most likely will be attacking the ball and facing the goal with most of the goal in front of you, whereas front post chances, again, you have to be a little more delicate with your finishing, don't you? And maybe a glance or something like that, a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to get space or be unmarked at the back post because generally a ball's going to go over a defender's head. This is something that I hear from a lot of the pundits that have played at the top level. So this isn't me speaking from experience, but what I've sort of vicariously consumed that. Yeah, when you can get away from a player and then, they're not there to put you under pressure or to block the shot, because I think we maybe underestimate how even having a defender close to you on you can put you off, or they can stop you trying to score a certain type of goal. And of course, they often say when the cross comes in one way, if you then make the near post run and the ball goes all the way through, get ready because you're then at the back post from the cross on the opposite side. So I think that helps in that regard. And of course, if you get a good enough back post cross or a cutback, you can always take the goalkeeper out of the equation, and then that makes it massively easier to score.
Newcastle in such a strong position at 5th place. They've got games in hand over everyone except for Brighton, and they're level on games with Liverpool. They've also got a 5-point gap to that clutch of 3 teams on 42 points. Looking good for a European spot next season, albeit could be in really any of the 3 European competitions at this stage. Liam, are they still in as good a shape as they were a couple of months ago when they went on that incredible run? And what does it look like?
I think not quite in terms of their underlying numbers. Their finishing's dried up a bit, but their style is interesting to me, how they sort of attack very differently from one side compared to the other. So down the left, they can be, a fairly bit more conservative and balanced. Byrne is quite a good overlapping fullback, but, played as a centre-back in the EFL and earlier in his career. He's not a trademark, hit the byline, overlap and deliver a cross. He's much more of an aerial player and defender. On the right, they've obviously got Trippier, who we know is quite the opposite, always wants to overlap, and that suits Miguel Almiron, who is a left-footed right winger who loves to come inside. Ahmed Walid wrote about sort of his combinations with Bruno Guimaraes earlier this season, and just how complementary they are of Bruno as someone who can play that threaded through ball. Almiron makes the runs in behind or will play 1-2s. So they're really balanced in that regard, and I think that can help to have different ways of attack. It's interesting that St Maximin, who is someone who I think was seen as sort of having to carry the team really under Bruce at times and be that sole attacking threat. I'm now seeing Newcastle fans and people that I speak to saying he's almost not really got away into the team because he's a bit too individualistic when they're trying to play a bit differently now. Of course, they're not the most expansive team, partly because they've got just a really good shot stopper who's better at kicking long. But again, yeah, it's a very unique system, and you compare that to Fulham, it's a different style. It's the same sort of shape, but in a very different way.
They've been quite a settled side as well this season. They've been quite fortunate with injuries overall. I think Almiron is out for a few weeks. I'm not entirely sure of the prognosis on it, but I will be interested to see what happens there, because to your point, Liam, that they have that real clear kind of triangle on that right-hand side, that if Almiron, which he will be injured for a short amount of time, will that affect their build-up and their attacking play, because they do rely on him quite heavily. Also, Isak coming back has actually already hit a little bit of form. He's had some issues with injury as well. So when you said about the goals drying up, small sample size alert, but the past couple of games he showed some form really.
Yeah. I would say visually he suddenly looks a lot sharper than I have seen before, albeit quite often in a sort of not a particularly poachy number 9 type. A lot of speed running in behind into the channels in particular, and then he is confident on the ball when it comes to that game against Wolves. He was constantly on it, trying to get inside and get shots off, and it hasn't quite come off just yet. He scored that lovely headed goal, didn't he, the other day? But certainly someone I've got my eye on for the last 10 games or so of the season. And that leads us to Brighton and Hove Albion. They're in 7th. Their manager, Roberto De Zerbi, came in after 6 games of the season to replace Graham Potter. He came into a very, very good situation, a situation that led to Potter getting the job at Chelsea. And De Zerbi didn't win in his first 5 league games, albeit that included Liverpool, Tottenham and Manchester City. It was a tough start, and they got through it, and then the sun came up. 27 points from 14 since then. 8 wins in that time, 31 goals scored, which is more than twice a game. They're in incredible shape, and De Zerbi is picking up a lot of credit, Liam. I heard on the coverage on Sunday, their FA Cup quarter-final game against Grimsby Town, Brighton always had him in mind to replace Potter. So we're going to talk about De Zerbi, but then we're going to talk about that more broadly. Brighton and Hove Albion, the way that club operates, the way that they have achieved consistent growth through excellent succession planning. We're going to try and unpick that over the next half an hour or so.
Clearly, we're going to work as hard as we can to keep Roberto for as long as we can, not only because he's a good coach, he's a good person, he fits the culture of the club really well, and obviously the fans are really enjoying what he's doing.
Given that he didn't know the league, Liam, I don't think it's a stretch to say that he's somewhat taken it by storm. I mean, better even, I dare say, than the tactics hipsters could have imagined. Because I'd already watched a lot of Twitter videos about De Zerbi's Shakhtar and their build-up, and I mean, it looked pretty good from where I was sitting, but translating styles across Serie A, the Ukrainian Premier League, and then the English Premier League, not the easiest thing in the world.
No, I think Sassuolo are probably more of a useful case study. I think, and from what I heard, I think Paul Barber in particular speak about was almost that as a more comparable project where you've got a team that's in the top half of one of Europe's top leagues. Obviously, Shakhtar are a lot more dominant in their league and maybe get analysed a bit more in depth in sort of the Champions League for quality of opposition. But when we spoke a few podcasts ago about sort of managerial cycles and styles within that, it's interesting that this is the kind of approach he used at Sassuolo. It's largely a 4-2-3-1 that he's not really deviated from. The main sort of quirk he will do with it is sometimes pull left back Pervis Estupiñán in more narrow, make a back three, and then sort of attack with a front five. And he did that against Grimsby purely because they were sat in a 5-4-1. Did the same against Bournemouth.
It was a remarkable match to watch that. It's genuinely, I think as someone who watches as much League Two football as I do Premier League football, it does remind you that it's almost a different sport. And I'm sure Grimsby would have felt that as well because of the way that Brighton approach things. You'd never see that in the fourth tier.
Yeah, I was pleased with the fans' hat on that it was quite professional, that we didn't end up making it into a really good sort of FA Cup spectacle. But the most interesting thing as a comparison to Potter really is now the emergence of actual sort of wingers, if you will. Potter never really played them. And that's obviously been the success of Karim Mitoma and Solly March. Solly March is someone that I think he had 4 Premier League goals in sort of 5 seasons, admittedly having played more defensive sort of wing-back roles. At number 10, a real versatile player in terms of positioning, and has just consistently played off the right. He's been a bit more sort of frequent in his shooting than Mitoma. He's more of a cut inside and will look to shoot. Matoma's been a lot more running behind, dribble 1v1, hit the byline, and has shown, I think, real good sort of variety for attacking crosses really well. I know he missed a great chance against Grimsby attacking the far post, but attacking those cutbacks where people associate inverted wingers with the Iron Robin type finish of dribbling inside and shooting to the far corner. There's one goal Mitoma scored like that this season, and we all know how good he's been. But yeah, that double pivot that they have behind them, often Alexis McAllister and Moises Caicedo, is the same that De Zerbi used at Sassuolo. And it was just fascinating that he's almost copied and pasted the same approach, and it's worked to the same degree. He's benefiting now from Evan Ferguson coming in and being a good sort of back to goal hold-up striker for someone who's as young as he is to bring those wingers and others into play. But I just think it's fascinating that he's able to utilise an approach so well and it fit the style.
Under Potter, Brighton were generally playing a 3 at the back system with 3 centre backs. That's obviously changed under De Zerbi. So what's that meant for their build up with Brighton, let's say, from a goal kick without being pressed extremely high? How would they generally approach things now under De Zerbi, and how different is that to how they went about things under Potter?
Yeah, they were quite organised under Potter, although maybe started to get a bit more direct towards the end. Often at 1-0 up or when winning in games, they play long from Sanchez, who obviously now, we'll get onto it, isn't necessarily the first choice keeper. But they're even more sort of organised and controlled and short, and really want that press from opposition. There'll be times where they'll play with the double pivot both really deep. Tifo have done a great video on this where they analyse it and break it down if people want to see it, because it's kind of harder to describe. But they do really nice exchange passes between the central midfielders. So Caicedo might receive it, he'll then pop it to McAllister, and he then plays a big switch because everyone's pressed in narrow, and suddenly the fullback or the winger is a really good outball. So they can be really, I think, nervous to watch it sometimes because they are really encouraging, quite literally, someone to be pressing on them and pushing them or going to tackle as they're releasing the pass. But
baiting, isn't it, is the word used.
Completely.
I find it amazing to watch, I must say, because as you say, the jeopardy of it.
Absolutely, and with the coaching hat on, that's something that takes time to embed and sort of install. So thinking how good it is now, you think give it another sort of 6 months, give him a pre-season, which he hasn't really had. He's not really had a proper transfer window either. So in that regard, I guess there's room to expect that to sort of go even further. And the real sort of change has been the lack of the long passes from the back. They build up a lot under Potter and with Sanchez, but one of his biggest strengths as a goalkeeper, Rob Sanchez, is his long distribution. So often he'd hit big switches, big diagonals out to the left to Marc Cucurella, who of course is no longer there either. And at times that would work really well. There's a great goal at Anfield where they play short, they recycle it, and then he pings one, and they quickly attack. They play through incisively and score. The same, one of the goals they scored against Manchester United at the Amex last May. Big switch to Cucurella, play incisively, and of course he's now said that he thinks still suits his approach better to be playing those passes through the middle into the pivot early. So no place for Sanchez currently.
Well, I've got the numbers on the long ball, and you go back to Houghton's last season, 19% of the whole passes that Brighton had were long balls, what we'd consider to be long balls, and it hovered either side of 12% under Potter.
Okay.
So, to your point, Liam, they didn't exactly play it a ton under Potter, but in the moments that allowed it, because Sanchez's long ball distribution was so accurate, and they were maximising his strength there. But now it's just over 7% of the passes under Roberto De Zerbi. Granted, not a full season's worth, but still, it shows that he's really doubled down on making sure that very rarely do Brighton ever pass long. And you said about baiting the press, it does instill a certain, or require a certain level of bravery from the players to be able to just keep going, even when there's maybe someone who's going to nick in, someone who's blocking the passing lane, someone who's blocking the cover shadow, whatever, to really continue to say, trust your players, trust your teammates, trust yourselves, trust me that this is the best way to play, and you'll bait the press to the extent where you're opening up spaces elsewhere, and they've shown it to great effect in ultimately being more direct when they beat that press, to be able to not sit against a deeper block, but to be able to actually expose the spaces.
Yeah, the tweaks that he's made to build up as well are interesting right from deep with what the front line do. So at times you've got March and Matoma as the two wingers are the most advanced and will look to basically be making these diagonal runs between fullback and centre-back from out on the touchline position. And it might be Ferguson or it might be Welbeck at times who will drop in deeper and effectively make a midfield box. So you've got the double pivot, whoever the number 10 is, maybe it's Pascal Gross, could be Adam Lallana, could be McAllister, and the pivot be different. But they'll often pull wide, and maybe it'd be Welbeck or Ferguson and be dropping in deeper. That happened a lot against Palace, where I think it was Welbeck was constantly looking to try and receive from Lewis Dunk. He was trying to pull sort of wider the midfield in Palace's sort of mid-block, and then try and receive that one on the angle to then play forward. And it then just sort of becomes these jigsaw pieces that are all sort of suddenly fluidly moving and trying to really bait that sort of line even higher and get Matoma and March sort of to be a lot more incisive. The through ball numbers have doubled from about 1 a game under Potter to over 2 under De Zerbi, which I know, as Mark says, is a small sample, but you consider some of the opposition they've played in that as well. Some real sort of top teams. I know some lower ranking teams as well, but consistently looking for that one in behind. The best example is Ferguson's goal at Stoke in the Cup, where Matoma makes that run for the pass between fullback and sort of centre back, and then gets that tapping for the cutback. So they just weren't passes that Potter seemed to want at all. Often it was a lot of recycled play, sort of like water polo style U-ring around the edge of the box where you're keeping it and then attacking through crosses, which a lot of the time did create high quality chances when they came off, because you're getting a chance close to goal, but often it was under pressure, it was aerial, maybe a header. Didn't always suit the players perfectly, I don't think, and by the end of Potter's reign it was interesting that there was a lot more in transition, which is maybe more akin to these incisive ones that De Zerbi wants.
Well, I actually looked at the location of the chance creation to your point there, Liam, and it was this season, it's 39% of the chances that they are created if you split the pitch into the attacking half of the pitch into 3. So the left channel, the central channel, and the right channel. And 39% are coming from the central third of the pitch, which kind of suggests what you're saying. If you're having those wingers that are coming from out to in, that the location of the chance created, the pass before that, is coming from a central area. So it is maybe Ferguson who's dropping in and then allowing the other players to make those runs ahead of them. So that's across the past 4 seasons, that's comfortably higher than any other time. So comparing it with there, where you're trying to maybe work it into those wider areas to get further up the pitch, but not necessarily be in a more lucrative position. So it's interesting to see that it's comfortably higher than any of the past 4 seasons there.
I really enjoyed that, just because over last summer, and Mark helped me out on this, we did a piece on sort of the dying art of the through ball that was basically on decline across Europe, sort of top leagues, that, you know, there was obviously VAR now to deal with offsides, sweeper goalkeepers, just more organised, better, compact defences. So to see teams now sort of trying to now play against those high lines and try and play through as maybe we'll start to see this not just be a Brighton thing, and maybe a wider sort of resurgence with those old school through balls.
I mean, their expected goals per shot number has gone up pretty significantly from last season to this season as well. Everything that you've described, the way that they are approaching build up in their defensive and middle third in order to create good chance in the final third, for me it paints a picture of a team that must be very difficult to defend against because of the variety of options, because of the intricacies of what they're trying to do. And, well, that's been borne out in the numbers. 31 goals in their last 14 games. Only Arsenal have scored more. Crucially, this is working in terms of actual goals, and it was a bit of a knock on Graham Potter for 2 seasons. Brighton's XG4 was notably high. Their goals did not tally up with it. They were underperforming their expected goals, and it caused a lot of head scratching. And we wondered whether it was just unfortunate and it would start to, the variance would kick in and they would have a better time of it. And yeah, that did broadly start to happen. But I wonder if we could just bring Potter in here and look back at his Brighton side, maybe his Chelsea side as well, who are struggling for goals and not creating a ton of chances for a Big Six team. Does this reflect badly on Potter, the fact that De Zerbi has managed to come in and just loosen everything up in such a way? Does it maybe raise a question mark about a blind spot of Potter's coaching and his management style?
I'll say kind of, but I think largely no. I think in the same way that Chelsea fans will now say his remit at Brighton was very different to what it is now at Chelsea, I think the same as we said for De Zerbi. Potter came in with a fairly older squad. Obviously wasn't the only changes that were made, but trying to make a younger squad that was playing more attractive football, that Brighton were not a top possession side. Their underlying numbers were quite poor, bottom 5 in the Premier League, and has pushed them. It took time, but it's pushed them up to really building good foundations now. And of course, he's not the only one that deserves credit for that, because you see he's now gone and the club is still doing just as well as it has done, if not even better. So he wasn't the sole part of that. But I think Potter's teams have always been about controlling the game as much as you can, winning the game or being the better team, between both boxes rather than in them. My big critique early on was that, and it sort of continued, was attacking against the low block is really hard to do. Part of it's easy to do in the sense that if a team wants to be defensive, they will let you keep the ball. You can play it around the edge of the box, but there's not that many strikers in the world that are elite at sort of attacking against a packed box. 1, to find space, 2, where to make the runs, and you need even better creators, I'd argue. It takes a real good player to find that incisive pass. I think we associate Kevin De Bruyne with someone that can pick lock, but there's not many in the league that can do that regularly, and it's really tough to do without sort of consistent good investment and good training. So as you've spoken about with sort of some of the other teams, that being adaptable is a really big thing. De Zerbi has shown some elements of being able to do that. Obviously, brought in someone like Matoma, which was done under Potter, or during his reign, I should say, and how much he had a say in that, I don't know. But he scored headed goals. He got the winner against Bournemouth, who was sat back in a low block that we couldn't pick apart, we could pick apart and then miss chances, and then he pops up to score. So yeah, I think some credit to De Zerbi for how he's utilising them in maybe a more effective way individually. I think Potter was really good at making a team which, the good old Gestalt theory of it was definitely more than some of its parts, especially early sort of 1920, where he had a lot of leftovers from what was a championship promoted squad. So the evolutions that were made were necessary and were really effective.
I think it goes back to the point that you made earlier, Ali, in terms of the quality, the average quality of the shot, in terms of Potter's reign. A little bit lower than maybe it is under Roberto De Zerbi now, in that they're maybe playing against lower blocks and trying to make sure that they dominate up until that box that you said, Liam, that the XG might be slightly inflated in suggesting that they actually have lower quality shots, but more of them. Whereas under Roberto De Zerbi, they're more clinical in the opportunities, but there's also the numbers to suggest that they are crafting more situations which allow them to put them in a better position to score. So, for example, 1.9 direct attacks per 90 under Graham Potter last season, and going up to the first few games of this season. That's 2.7 per 90 under De Zerbi. And we've spoken about direct attacks before as a proxy of counter-attacking, that they are kind of more willing to maximise and make the use of those transitional moments, whereas under Potter it might be a case even more so of resetting, allowing yourself as the team in possession to get structured, but then also allowing the opposition to get structured and trying to start again. Those quality chances that you're going to generate aren't going to be as high as if you're going to just maximise and make the most of those transitional moments.
Right, but we should mention the flip side of the more chaotic approach. I think we discussed the fact that Potter's team, they didn't really want to engineer moments of chaos or transition. If anything, they wanted to keep the ball partly as a defensive tactic, and their defensive numbers were very, very good. How did De Zerbi's defensive numbers compare?
Yeah, they're a bit worse, and particularly worse when you consider later in Potter's reign. So under Graham Potter, per game, they faced 1.7 big chances, 1.2 goals against per game, which was about the same as the XGA they conceded, but about 30% clean sheet rate, so close to 1 in 3, and that's across the entirety of his reign. If you go from just the start of 2021-22, it was about 1 in 3, so that's really, really good when you consider what they're pushing for in the league. Again, small sample size, Claxon, slightly more goals conceded, conceded from De Zerbi, 1.4 a game. They've only kept 4 clean sheets in 18 Premier League games, which comes out at 22%. So when they can be more chaotic, they can have issues sort of going the other way, which isn't necessarily a problem because they're scoring so many now. And the impressive part with that is that I think a lot of the easy narratives were Brighton just need a 15/20 goal a season striker. They still don't have one. They've got 3 players with 7 goals this season, which includes Leandro Trossard, who's obviously now at Arsenal, Alexis McAllister, if you include penalties, Solly March is on 7, and Pascal Gross and Karim Matoma both have 6 each. So it's really well sort of spread around, which again is fine if you have that or sort of a high-scoring player. But you look at how they've sort of managed games late on, and there have been issues at times. There's been points dropped. There's been games where they've maybe not come back as well when they have gone behind. One of the biggest strengths towards the end under Potter was how many games they won after going ahead. So they won 16 of 19 games and didn't lose under Potter after going ahead from the start of 2021-22 until all the way through to the end of his reign, mid-2022-23. And that includes Manchester United, that includes Arsenal, Tottenham, West Ham. Sorry, that's Manchester United twice as well. That's home and away. So it's quite incredible when you consider it's not just teams you maybe quote-unquote expect them to beat. And I think that's a way to win. We spoke before about sort of managers having different styles and different approaches. And I think fans maybe get more on board with De Zerbi's because it's more we want to outscore a team rather than we want to win and maybe keep a clean sheet.
That is a good thing to raise, just to touch on the idea behind Potter's approach, which maybe broadly we could say is more based on control. And when they went ahead, boy, did they control things very, very well, whereas De Zerbi's team may struggle a little more on that front.
Yeah, and I think one of Potter's strength, and it still is now at Chelsea, is that he is more of a tinkerer and he is able to have that control based on also the strengths of the opposition and making sure that he nullifies that. Whereas De Zerbi has a lot of control in the really strong principles that he likes to play, which we've spoken about and we will continue to touch upon here. I guess one question that I ask in terms of next season, now because De Zerbi has such a clear style of play, everyone will have played Brighton once, at least, maybe twice. Will they be a little bit more predictable to play against? Whereas where Potter can come into his own there is that because he can chop and change and go from a back 3 to a back 4, different midfield, etc. Does he make himself more predictable as a manager? But then you got to take the rough with the smooth because of what we just said there. So it's posing the question as much as anything. But I think it'll be interesting to see in the next sort of 12 months.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing I think we criticised or had question marks over Antonio Conte for at Spurs as a sort of more elite level example of that. And to give Potter a lot of credit now, his Chelsea team are struggling to score goals, but they're also really quite good defensively. They're one of the best teams in the Champions League in the group stages. I know their group might not have been the best, but they conceded once against Dortmund in the knockout legs, and that's a transition from a corner.
From their own corner.
Exactly, yeah. Which we've already broken down on a previous pod if people want to listen to the breakdown of that. But it's just different ways of doing things, and that's fine. And I get that almost once you've had a few years of Potter doing that control thing, people then go, no, I want the other thing now. And there's then been times this season where I've gone, I quite miss the control and seeing out a game 2-0 rather than this chaotic sort of way of doing it. But there's merits to both. And as long as you're winning, as we said before on the manager cycle, it's fine. People don't ask questions. Whether there's then a drop off, we wait and see.
Well, let's move from on-field tactics to off-field strategy. It's unavoidable when we talk about Brighton and Hove Albion to talk about what they do off the field and how they do it and why they do it and why it appears to be working quite so well. From managerial succession planning, from Houghton to Potter to De Zerbi, and also in terms of player recruitment, Mitoma and McAllister and Caicedo, probably the top 3 on the podium right now for players that Brighton and Hove Albion spent a certain amount of money on, who they will sell for a lot more money, having performed very well for the team itself. Mark, pretty broad question. What, as you understand it, is Brighton's scouting and recruitment process or philosophy? And why isn't anyone else doing it as well?
It's difficult to say why no one else is doing it quite as well. If anyone knew, then I suppose everyone would be doing it. I guess Liam's in a better position to maybe know from the inside a little bit more, but I'm obviously going to be speaking about data a little bit. And I think that...
Hope so.
Yeah, I think it's a wider point that a lot of clubs, professional clubs specifically in the Premier League, are using data. They have a data scientist, a data analyst, and they're very, very well qualified individuals. I think where Brighton and Brentford, to a different extent, differ. Liverpool, you can include in that as well, is that the culture from top to bottom is data-led. And it's very much, you have the buy-in from everyone to know that this is what we're all pulling in the same direction. And any information that is data-led, whether it is recruitment, staff members, managers, obviously the way that they got De Zerbi in a short space of time, they had a really clear idea that they wanted him when Potter left or was being spoken to. That succession planning, player level as well, is so clear from top to bottom, rather than, as I say, and I've spoken to people who I know can offer data, but it's not necessarily received as well by the coaching staff, by the managers, by the board, etc. So I think that's where Brighton have a real clear strength, and other clubs have it too, but Brighton definitely, in this example, are really clear in their data culture, and it's proving to be very lucrative in the way that they are buying at a low risk, low
cost.
Yeah, low cost, and selling for a high fee as well. And they've done it time and time again to show that this is not by chance. This is certainly by design.
Mark's spot on. There's a few things that I want to sort of touch on further that maybe get a bit overlooked. One is that from an academy perspective, when you look at their sort of catchment area of the players that they're allowed to recruit up to certain ages, has to be within, I think it's a 90-minute drive. At older age groups, it might be down to an hour in the younger ones, but without sounding stupid here, half of that is in the sea for them. So they have to be a bit more creative in how they do things. Compare that to the likes of Arsenal, where you're going to extend that for 90 minutes north and south. You've just got a bigger catchment area, the same up north with sort of Manchester United, etc. And of course, they've got Southampton to compete with, or other sort of clubs around the south coast, but Southampton having a very prestigious, famous academy, it just generally makes things a bit more difficult. They still do really well at academy level. The team is up in the PL2, they're performing really well, and they're constantly now getting graduates through. And they're also balancing that well with sort of developing players from young or recruiting older players that maybe get released. Of course, Ben White is the famous example from Southampton. So again, you need that balance all the way through. That I think Chelsea are a very rare example of being able to sort of get 4, 5, 6 players from under 9s all the way through. That doesn't really happen. That's not the standard. That's just exceptional. And that's all, again, because their coaching and player development sort of pathway now is really, really good. So Dan Ashworth came in off the back of sort of revolutionising what the FA did and undertook a similar process there. I have no idea what he did, but I know it worked really, really well. And of course, the EPP came along with all of that as well. But other clubs, sort of the analogy I've seen on Twitter is they don't need to shop in the same sort of shops. So bigger clubs, let's take Arsenal and City at the top of the league, probably don't need to be recruiting in these other leagues and sort of the more obscure leagues around the world, because they've got the finances and they've got the pulling power, they've got the luxury of European football that players already want. So they don't need to do that because clubs like Brighton exist. So I don't see there being a requirement for Arsenal to go out and find a Karim Matoma and develop them themselves.
And is there any possibility that if they could continue on this cycle for a certain amount of time, they really could rise up the food chain pretty significantly? Because Dan Ashworth spoke to The Athletic a couple of years ago. I found the quote yesterday saying, if we fish in the same pools at the same time as 10 or 11 clubs, we'll lose because we don't have the financial clout or the promise of Champions League football or the Europa League to try to attract players. So we've either got to see them first in a different pool, or we've got to go younger and try and develop them. If we go head-to-head with, say, Everton, they've got a different story to tell, a different financial package to buy, and to retain the player. Surely they're strengthening those weak spots, both the offering of potentially European football. That's not going to happen at Everton anytime soon. And in theory, if you are doubling, tripling your revenue with player sales, then surely there'll be more in the kitty.
Yeah, I think it's knowing from the player's perspective, they're providing more and more evidence that the player will get game time, because I think that's if they want a pathway into the Premier League. And I'm sure this isn't what the likes of Paul Barber as the CEO is necessarily saying, but words to the effect of, if you come to the Premier League, you'll play for us, you'll certainly get the minutes. And if you are really that special of a player, and Arsenal and Manchester City and Liverpool and Manchester United, Chelsea, etc., do come calling, we won't stand in your way. And I think that's a good model for them financially, as I say, to sell on for a huge fee, but to know that they are going to get those minutes, rather than, as you say, Arsenal don't need to, etc., don't need to buy in that same market. Then it's beneficial for everyone, I think. And I was thinking about this the other day in terms of Enzo Fernandez. I think Benfica signed him from River Plate for £9 million, and we know how much he went for Chelsea. But Chelsea would never have, or would rarely have gone straight to River Plate. And it's the same player, but it almost needs to have the evidence that this player can play in a top 5, 6 European league, can play Champions League football. That if you'd have just maybe took a little bit of a risk on buying that £9 million player who wasn't as proven in that league, then maybe they could have saved themselves a lot of money, basically. And I think Brighton are at least maybe that conduit a little bit more. They're able to give players who are of a lower risk those minutes, and then they can sell them on if they need to.
There's 3 things they do better than most clubs. One is they're more self-aware. I think Brighton as a place is a bit different to other parts of England anyway, but they know where they are as a club, as Ashworth has sort of spoken, and being very honest, and as we said before, that other clubs will recruit or do things based on what they want to be, maybe more so than what they are, and they'll target things that are maybe outside of their range or recruit the wrong players. The second and third things are kind of tied together. They're prepared and patient to let players develop, and that's because they also allow players to go out on loan. They'll buy players and loan them back. If you look at Caicedo as a good example, went and spent time at Beerschot, I think it was, in Belgium. Karim Mitoma spent time on loan at Union Saint-Gilloise, having come across from sort of Japan as well. And Alexis McAllister spent time when he was signed in Argentina, spent time alone at Boca Juniors, which of course is better experience than what you're going to get for playing for Brighton, because he played in the Copa Libertadores, which is obviously the South American equivalent of the Champions League. So that is above what he was expected to do at Brighton. And those players were signed and have, people say, burst onto the scene, but they've been a player that's been a work in progress from the club's perspective for 2-3 years already. Like, these aren't overnight successes. These are things that are planned and meticulously done. There's a loans manager, there has been for years now, and they're just, as we said before, with like football getting increasingly more impatient and short term, they just trust things to think long term, and that's probably down to Tony Bloom's background as a gambler, but also a fan of the club. He's probably got the perfect balance in having had success and working in an industry that requires you to be so objective, where you need to be honest and you need to be aware. He gambles, he plays poker professionally, he owns a horse. He's all these successful things that I think feed into what he does as a chairman.
Yeah, and a word for Paul Barber as well. He's been there for a long time, I think 11 years now as well. And I was listening to a podcast with him, and he was basically saying how they look to recruit from a position of strength, because if they would have sold Caicedo to Arsenal recently, as they were tipped to maybe do, then everyone would have known that they had a pot of cash to then try and find another midfielder. But they always recruit from a position of strength, where when they were seeing Bissouma doing really well, they had Caicedo already in the building, already on the books, I should say, to be able to know that when Bissouma does eventually leave, because he's on a very sharp upward trajectory, we've got Caicedo to come in. And they're sort of constantly doing that across all positions. So it's, I guess, no surprise that when one player leaves, there's so many examples of high profile players leaving, they've got someone else where the quality doesn't really drop off in the player, because they've thought about this over a long period, rather than think, oh, we've lost Dan Burn, we better get someone in quickly, and also not from a position of strength. So they very much do think in the long term, and it speaks to the model of the club. And
it's not always a case of just like trying to directly replace the player's profile or specifically their stats. I don't want to use the Moneyball analogy, but it's kind of tied to that of, as long as you can get out of the team what you were doing before or better with this player, maybe it looks slightly different, that's fine. It doesn't need to be, oh, we're losing this left winger that plays in a certain way, we need the exact same thing again. No, it's like, we can do this differently.
Not just the players as well. They've lost Director of Football Dan Ashworth, Head of Recruitment Paul Winstanley, Liam Tharm as well, and they've kept moving up the league. I guess for those listening who don't support Brighton, maybe they support another Premier League team and they would like their team to do similar things to Brighton. How feasible do you think this, as in what we've just discussed, clearly quite a complicated thing that takes time to implement and courage to execute, how feasible is that to replicate? I've got Southampton springing to mind here, just because of the involvement of Rasmus Ankersen, of course, formerly of Brentford. Do you think there are teams who will try and build this sort of structure and try and replicate the success? Is it a feasible thing or a one-off?
Difficult to answer. I think that, going back to my point before, I think it has to be from top to bottom in terms of that data-led approach. It's clear that for everything that we've said, it's long-term, it's top to bottom, it's a full culture. Maybe if a club would try to replicate it and were to hire a few data analysts, no, it wouldn't work quite in the same way. So it has to be kind of absolutely all in or not at all, I think. So difficult one to answer. But comparing with Southampton, or I guess Leicester previously, as someone probably most recently who punched above their weight, they were the ones who everyone was raving about. They were getting into Europe. They were doing so well. This is even after they won the Premier League in recent seasons, and they've dropped off a little bit. So without sort of answering pessimistically, I think this is really good for Brighton at the moment, and it's shown how long-term their success has been climbing up the football pyramid. But if we're talking about them right at the upper echelon, we need to maybe consider this again in 12 months, 18 months time, because they've had a really clear model. But if they are going to continue to maybe lose players and replace them, there's maybe only so long that can carry on. And because there's always going to be an element of risk to the recruitment. So they're a fantastically run club, but if it's going to be sustainable in the long term, we need to maybe wait in the long term.
I don't think clubs should replicate it for the sake of replicating it because it looks nice and looks like it's working. Again, it's what the club needs to be successful. Clubs are all built differently. They have different pathways for things, different structures, different styles of play. And Brighton, as Mark says, did things in a very long-term way. Potter was given a contract extension very early into his tenure. I think within sort of 6 months because they liked what they saw. They stuck with him in periods where I think went 10 or 11 games unbeaten, 5 losses in a row. They admittedly came in a season where Brighton up with a record Premier League points total. So I guess if you sat down before the start of the season and said, what were your expectations, and you ticked those off, great, that's fine. If that comes in the middle of having a really bad patch where other clubs, like we've just seen with Crystal Palace as a prime example, sort of saying, no, we're going to get rid of you, that worked both ways. We've chatted all about the managerial stuff before, so I won't go over that again. But it's doing things in a way that work because of Brighton's specific circumstances, not just going, oh, Data's nice and modern and forward thinking. It's because it works for that specific club. So I can see people going, oh, Data looks cool and innovative and new, and it's that shiny thing that everyone then wants to go for to be like, oh, we're using Data now. It's like, okay, but what's your why sort of thing?
Let me tie it all together with a strong shot of something topical. Might they need to succession plan once more in the dugout? Tottenham Hotspur's manager, Antonio Conte, is, as we record, still the Tottenham Hotspur manager. But you wouldn't know it based on the coverage of Tottenham Hotspur this week. We think that Tottenham might be looking for a new manager. And Roberto De Zerbi's name, inevitably, is on the list. Put your personal bias aside, Liam. I know you wouldn't want him to go to Tottenham. Do you think he might fit there?
Yeah, I think there's a list of other managers that do. I made the shout for Thomas Tuchel earlier in the week as someone that maybe fit the style I thought a bit better and has more success at achieving what they wanted in terms of things like Champions League. So he fits, but I think there's quite a few that fit. Spurs' problem really is that their identity's been maybe a bit too specific under Conte, and they've not they've sort of lurched between these coaches of trying to sort of desperately, I think, really win a trophy and succeed in the Champions League. But I think they need something very immediate and impactful because Son and Kane I think Son's now 30, Kane's 29, that they've got two really outstanding world-class players, maybe not quite as good as the rest of the squad, but they've got two key players who are, if they're not in their peak years now, are coming out of them, and you need to sort of squeeze every last drop out of them that you can.
I think he would improve Spurs on and off the ball. The way that Spurs fans at the moment think that it's quite drab to actually watch a game of football there. So I think he would certainly improve Spurs. I think he would actually have a good fit for all the reasons that Liam said. And I think going back to what we've spoken about earlier, I don't think that the Brighton board will be under any illusions that he will be sought after in the coming season. So they'll probably already be looking at other managers anyway, just as a potential succession plan. Basically, they're not stupid and they know that he's a very good manager. So irrespective of what happens, I do think Brighton, which is again the theme of this whole podcast, will be looking so long term to know that they will find someone if he were to ever leave.
Heading to Wembley for the FA Cup semi-final, potentially heading overseas in European football next season. Brighton and Hove Albion, Roberto De Zerbi. It was about time we went deep. Thank you so much to Liam and to Mark for talking me through it all. One of the most interesting teams in English football. Absolutely no doubt about that. That's been this week's episode. Please join us again next week. Make sure you're subscribed to this podcast feed. Michael will be back and reinvigorated and refreshed, no doubt. theathletic.com/tactics to sign up to The Athletic today. You'll pay £1.99 a month for the first 12 months of your subscription. He's still been churning out some very interesting articles, Michael Cox, so I would suggest that you sign up today if you haven't already. And join us, please, next time on the Athletic Football Tactics podcast.
The Athletic.